The story Night Train from Montreal is set in the early 1970s. Among his family, friends and business associates, William Tufnell's aversion to flying was legendary. On a business trip to Massachusetts, he had been scared out of his wits by an aborted landing, in which the plane had suddenly zoomed upwards at full power while on final approach. The pilot's laconic, "Sorry about that, folks, there was another plane already on the runway," had done nothing to calm his fears, far from it. The final straw came one sunny summer Sunday morning in 1970, when Air Canada Flight 621 from Montreal, en route to Los Angeles, crashed in a field near Brampton. The co-pilot had erroneously deployed the ground spoilers while the plane was still 60 feet above the tarmac of Toronto International Airport. After that, William resolved that he would never fly again. William's thriftiness was equally the stuff of legend. As a member of the board of directors of Households Incorporated, William would have been entitled to drive to Montreal from his home near Guelph, Ontario, for directors' meetings, and stay overnight in a hotel at the company's expense. He could even have engaged the services of a driver for the journey by road, which had become significantly more convenient following the completion of the Macdonald-Cartier Freeway in 1964. However, William much preferred to take the train. He could board the Chicago to Toronto train near his home at its stop in Guelph in the late evening, and transfer to the 11:30 p.m. overnight sleeper to Montreal, which would bring him into the heart of the city, well rested, at 7:30 the next morning. The train fare even included a light breakfast and coffee, brought to his bedroom by the steward as the train navigated the outer suburbs of Montreal. After a full day of meetings, the reverse journey allowed William to leave Montreal again at 11:30, arriving in Toronto just in time to catch the Chicago-bound train out to Guelph. Comfortable, relaxing, and the return fare was significantly cheaper than just a single night at one of the higher-end Montreal hotels. Even with dinner at a nice restaurant prior to boarding the train home, William's expense account was notable for its frugality. There was, however, a third reason for Director Tufnell's preference for rail travel. Her name was Emily Henshaw. Emily, a divorcee, lived on one of the new condominium developments on Avenue Road in Toronto. William's travel agent, a discreet man, would order 2 sleeping accommodations on the same train whenever William's directorship took him to Montreal. He would also provide separate bills. One would appear on William's Chargex account, which was forwarded to Household's financial department. The other was paid in cash. Although the train steward checked Mr. Tufnell and Mrs. Henshaw into separate accommodations in the same car, he was unaware, for it was not his business to be aware, these 2 travellers might find the night time lonely and seek mutual companionship. And during the day, while Director Tufnell considered the past, present and future of Households Incorporated, Mrs. Henshaw would take advantage of a shopping expedition along St. Catherine Street, visiting stores such as those of the Tea Eaton Company, the Hudson's Bay Company and Henry Burke's Limited. After mutually exhausting days, dinner at a fine restaurant made for pleasant company before reboarding the train, again with only one of the meals credited to William's Chargex card. On an evening in October 1972, following a day when the leaves seemed to burst with hues of red and gold, William left his home between Guelph and its northern neighbour of Elora. He was accompanied by his loyal and faithful wife Elizabeth, who, as always, kindly agreed to drive him to the C&R railway station in Guelph. William kissed Elizabeth tenderly on the cheek, murmuring that he would see her the morning after next, and alighted the car. Elizabeth meanwhile got out of the passenger seat and walked round to the driver's side for the journey home. After checking one last time that William had indeed remembered his ticket, she drove off. Truth to tell, she was not entirely unhappy to be alone at home, as her all-consuming interest was her garden. Besides the usual flowers and vegetables, Elizabeth was acknowledged in local horticultural circles as an expert on the subject of medicinal plants, of which her garden had an extensive collection. She had researched exhaustively the traditional medicines of the original inhabitants of southwestern Ontario, and had at one point written a pamphlet on the subject that had been favourably regarded by the local extension specialist of the Ontario Ministry of Agriculture and Food. Quite frequently, even the horticulture department of the Ontario Agriculture College would refer to her inquiries on this subject that its respected professors were unable to answer. Concurrently with Elizabeth's drive home, William waited for the arrival of the Chicago train, late again. Fortunately, there was plenty of time to make his connection, and in the event of extreme lateness, the CNR would hold the overnight train to Montreal, which after all had a leisurely 8 hours to traverse the 350 miles to its destination. Finally, the train appeared. William boarded the Amtrak coach with its new red, white and blue livery and a stripe along its shiny stainless steel side, and attempted to select a seat free of the newspapers and other clutter that had accumulated during the 10-hour journey from Chicago. Tonight, the train arrived in Toronto Union Station at 11:15, leaving just a comfortable 15 minutes for William to settle himself on the Montreal train. His sleeper car, Green Bank, had the charcoal and light grey livery, the latter with the red wet noodle CN logo that gave Canadian National Railways cars a more contemporary look than the former olive green and black with yellow trim. Green Bank features 6 so-called sections, meaning curtained sleeping berths, 4 double bedrooms and 6 roomettes. William had reserved for himself a bedroom as befitting his status as director of a public company, while Emily was caught in one of the less commodious roomettes. Promptly at 11:30 p.m. the train drew out of Toronto, powered by its General Electric diesel locomotive, its high central round headlamp giving it the appearance of a mechanical cyclops. Trundling through the night, the train made stops at towns such as Cobourg, Belleville, Kingston, Brockville and Cornwall, at times remaining sidelined and stationary to allow freight traffic to pass. Shortly before 7 o'clock, the steward passed along the corridor, knocking on the doors of the bedrooms and roomettes to announce that the train would arrive in Montreal in something under half an hour. Sleepy thank yous greeted him from some of these, while others were silent. A little later, some doors were opened at the steward's knock, and fresh coffee was handed in. The train arrived at Montreal Central Station right on time at 7:30 a.m, and the passengers streamed off to their onward destinations. For the most part, those who had travelled in the luxury of the sleeping cars had a fresher appearance than those who had endured an uncomfortable night in coach, besides which they had washed and the men had shaved. However, no one had appeared from either the bedroom of Mr. William Tufnell nor the roomette of Mrs. Henshaw. Before leaving the train, it was the steward's responsibility to ensure that all passengers had indeed detrained, so that the train could be taken out of service to be cleaned. Urgent knocking afforded no response from either of the accommodations in question. The roomette, which was locked from the outside, yielded to the pass key. An overnight bag lay on the chair, along with the day clothes in which Mrs. Henshaw had boarded the train. The bed was still folded up against the wall, but of the lady herself there was no sign. The bedroom, however, was locked from the inside. Uncertain what to do, the train crew called the CNR Railway Police Detachment at Central Station, who in due time forced the door open. To their shock, horror and astonishment, this revealed the partly clad bodies of passengers Tufnell and Henshaw, their faces frozen into a rictus of paralysis and an overpowering stench of human excreta. CNR police immediately closed the door and called the city police, as well as the Sûreté de Québec and the staff of the coroner's office, who arrived with gowns, masks and rubber gloves. The train was moved to the cleaning depot for reasons of privacy, though not before a passing local journalist had witnessed the commotion around the otherwise deserted cars. This worthy, by dint of persuasion, managed to ascertain from one of the members of the CN station staff whom he knew that the bodies of 2 passengers had been discovered on the train, 1 male and 1 female. Consequently, while the detectives and medical examiners went about their business of inspecting Green Bank and its deceased passengers for clues about what might have occurred, and interviewing the steward for any unusual happenings on the journey between Toronto and Montreal, the newsroom of the Montreal Gazette almost thrummed with speculation. Who were the deceased? Was it murder? A murder-suicide, perhaps? A love tryst gone sour? A mafia hit? Who knew? Finally, late in the day, a brief news release from police headquarters revealed that 2 persons, a man and a woman, had been found dead when the overnight train from Toronto had arrived that morning in Montreal. No details concerning the cause of death were available, and the names of the deceased would be withheld, pending notification of the next of kin. The story was carried on the local evening newscasts and merited a paragraph on an inside page of the next day's Gazette. At much the same time that morning, as early rising Anglophone citizens of Montreal were opening their copies of the Gazette, Elizabeth Tufnell reversed her car out of the garage and drove the 10 miles or so from her home to the CNR station in Guelph. There she awaited the arrival of the 7:40 Toronto to Chicago train, which did not arrive until a little before 8 o'clock. But when the train arrived, William was not among the passengers who alighted. Not unduly anxious, Elizabeth contacted the station agent, determined that whether the overnight train from Montreal had arrived too late for William to make his connection. No, she was told after some delay while the inquiry was made, the Montreal train had arrived in plenty of time. Or maybe William's business households had been carried over to the next day. It was not like William not to notify her. William decided to take herself off for a coffee at the Peacock restaurant and wait to see if William was on the next train from Montreal. But by the time the next train had arrived with still no sign of William, Elizabeth decided to telephone Househol's head office in Montreal to ascertain whether the directors' meeting had been extended to today. No, she was assured. The meeting had ended as usual at 4 p.m. the previous day, after which the directors had enjoyed their usual brandy and soda before going their separate ways. No, the chairman's secretary was sure that Mr. Tufnell had not been required to return this morning. This left Elizabeth in a quandary, since she had no idea of William's whereabouts. Moreover, she was due to attend a meeting of the local chapter of the IODE that afternoon, where she was supposed to pour the tea for the other ladies and report on the quarterly profits of the Opportunity Shop, the so-called Op Shop, whose profits funded the several university scholarships awarded annually to serving young ladies from the county. Since there was nothing further that she could do in Guelph, Elizabeth returned home to change ready for her IODE meeting. Just before lunch came a knock on the door. An officer from the local Ontario Provincial Police Detachment stood on her doorstep, wearing a sombre expression. "Mrs. Tufnell," he asked. "Yes, what may I do to you?" "Perhaps I could come in." "Certainly." Elizabeth led the office through to her country kitchen. "Sorry about the mess. I had to go to the station early this morning to meet my husband, but he must have missed my train. I only just got back." "Yes, ma'am, I'm afraid that's what I've called about. Would you like to take a seat?" They sat down at the kitchen table. "I'm afraid I have some bad news. It seems that your husband was taken ill last night on the train to Montreal." "Is he in the hospital?" "No, ma'am. I'm terribly sorry to have to tell you this, but my information is that he passed away from whatever it was that he had caught. I'm really sorry to have to give you this news." Elizabeth took this news in without external emotion. She appeared to be frozen. "Is there anyone I could call to stay with you for a while?" said the officer, whose badge proclaimed his name to be Wilcox. "A son or daughter? Friends? Neighbours?" "No, thank you. I think I'd rather be alone at the moment, but thank you." "Can you tell me where William has been taken?" asked Elizabeth after a moment. "I must go and see him as soon as I can." "I'm sorry," replied Officer Wilcox. "I have not yet been given that information. Would you mind if I used your telephone to call the detachment office in Guelph to see if they have that information yet?" "Certainly," replied Elizabeth, but when Officer Wilcox made the call, he found there was no further news. He stayed with Elizabeth for a while to make sure there was nothing further that he could do before leaving the house for his black and white squad car. Meanwhile, back in Montreal, the bodies of William and Emily had long since been removed to the morgue for autopsies. Their identities had been established from William's wallet found in the bedroom and then Emily's handbag found in the roomette. Their soiled nightclothes were removed and the bodies washed, while throughout the procedure the staff continued to maintain the strict protocols to guard against airborne infection. Stomach contents were sent off for toxicological examination, but there seemed to be no correlation between their contents. William and Emily had eaten nothing in common. Both bodies showed cyanosis of the skin, suggesting that death might have occurred through asphyxiation. This was a very strange case, thought the medical examiners, but finally they had to admit they could shed no further light on the situation until the results of bacteriology and toxicology were available. And so it was that William and Emily had a final opportunity to rest together, side by side, for the next 3 days in adjacent compartments of the mortuary cooler. Subsequently, the results of the tests revealed no adverse bacteriology or toxicology, but samples were retained in case further examination might be necessary. Inevitably, more news on this bizarre case had now leaked out. That evening, the Montreal news media reported the names of the mysterious deceased persons on the overnight train, and the less respectful news outlets added the information they had been found in the same bedroom compartment. The news went over the wire services and was inescapably picked up in Guelph. However, the local newspaper, the Guelph Daily Mercury, tactfully omitted the location where the two bodies had been found, choosing instead to focus on the details concerning the life of prominent local citizen William Tufnell, president of the Tufnell and Armstrong engineering firm and a former president of the local Rotary Club. The National Enquirer, however, was less scrupulous when it caught wind of the story, which it ran under the headline "Businessman and Paramour Dead in Rolling Love Nest." Titillating details about the finding of the bodies accompanied the article, which, although it would not appear for a week, would ultimately be prominently displayed at the checkout counters of Guelph supermarkets. Eventually, at about the same time, the coroner's office in Montreal decided that they could reach no firm conclusions concerning the deaths of either William Tufnell or Emily Henshaw. With the consent of the police, who could see no grounds for suspecting foul play, they released the bodies, but took the precaution that they must remain in so-called body bags and that subsequent funerals must be closed casket to guard against infection by some unknown agent. Under the circumstances, Elizabeth realised that church service might be unseemly, and so the funeral service was held in the chapel of a local funeral home. A significant crowd attended: William's business and service club associates, friends of William and Elizabeth, and a selection of the merely curious readers of the National Enquirer. Short reflections were offered by Hazel, William and Elizabeth's older daughter, by Jim Armstrong, William's business partner, and by the first vice president of the Rotary Club. The United Church minister made a brave attempt to cover the situation from a theological perspective, but found that many of his stock paragraphs for funeral homilies were not quite suited to the occasion. After dwelling briefly on the uncertainty of life, in keeping from the reading from Ecclesiastes, he made reference to Elizabeth's loyalty and devotion as wife and mother. This occasioned a snigger from the back of the room, hastily covered by a cough, and disapproving stares from those seated close by. A suitable funereal note was restored by singing "Abide With Me," which brought tears to the eyes of many. The reception afterwards was a rather sombre affair, it being felt indecorous under the circumstances to exchange the stories and memories of good times with the deceased that normally characterised these occasions. Accordingly, a significant proportion of the egg salad and salmon sandwiches that had been provided remained uneaten. Let us go back now in time 3 weeks before any of the aforementioned events. Flies, it is said, see many things while attached to walls. One fly on the wall, had it been able to report its findings, would have made several curious observations. The wall in question was part of Elizabeth's potting shed, where she was unstringing a necklace composed of the seeds of the rosary pea, purchased the previous year when she and William had taken a vacation to Trinidad. On an impulse, Elizabeth had purchased the necklace from a beach vendor, intrigued by the bright red seeds with their single black eye. Today, however, Elizabeth was working in the potting shed, clad in a loosely fitting house coat over her day clothes, as well as a face mask, such as those used by installers of drywall, and rubber gloves. Carefully she cracked open the shell of each rosary pea seed and ground it to powder using a pestle and mortar. Then she placed the powder in a small jar. Another day, another fly, and another wall. This new hexapedal witness would also have remarked on curious observations. It was the day that William was to set off on his ill-fated journey. Elizabeth, as part of her wifely duties, was packing William's overnight bag. It was remarkable. Elizabeth had almost a furtive air about her, even though the wall in question belonged to the bedroom that she and William had shared for 20 years. Once again, she was wearing the loose house coat, mask and gloves. This time, however, she took the small jar of powdered rosary pea flour and poured its contents into William's pyjamas. The reason for this curious activity was observations that Elizabeth had made over the past several months on the subject of William's silk pyjamas. Each time that William visited Montreal as a director of households, she noted that his pyjamas carried both certain stains on the trouser portion and a faint odour of Chanel No. 5. Elizabeth herself did not wear a perfume. William would not have noticed the scent as he was a smoker. Elizabeth therefore reasoned that William must meet an inamorata on the train, since that was where he slept. From her knowledge of botany, Elizabeth was aware of the toxic nature of the seeds of the rosary pea. Their hard and indigestible shells render them harmless when eaten, for they simply pass right through the digestive tract unchanged. In contrast, the kernel of the rosary pea contains the toxin abrin, similar but about 100 times more potent than ricin, the more familiar toxic substance found in the seeds of the castor bean plant. The United States Center for Diseases Control reports that inhalation of minute amounts of abrin causes respiratory distress, difficulty breathing, fever, cough, nausea and tightness in the chest and heavy sweating. Fluid then builds up in the lungs, which makes breathing even more difficult, so the skin often turns blue. Death results from low blood pressure and respiratory failure. When William unfolded his pyjamas, this powder dispersed into the air, where it was inhaled by both he and Emily, with fatal consequences. Our next story will be Not Quite Dead, which is part of the fantasy collection.